Welcome to the Paranormal Northwest podcast. This podcast is all about the history of the Pacific Northwest, the people who built it, and those who may have never left. Each week, I will travel around the region, telling the history of a place and its paranormal stories. The Pacific Northwest region encompasses Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, British Columbia, Canada, and Alaska. To start us off, I want to take a look at a place that has a deep history in the Pacific Northwest and involves all of the areas in this region. So much of the history of the Pacific Northwest is spread throughout this region. So for this, our very first episode, I will be taking a little bit of a deeper historical dive than in future episodes. Trust me, it'll be worth it. Today we are visiting Fort Vancouver in Washington State. So here we go. Fort Vancouver is an integral part of Northwest history. The Pacific Northwest has been inhabited for thousands of years. Traveling around the region, you encounter names that immortalize and honor the indigenous inhabitants. From the often heard Seattle, Spokane, and Tacoma, to the less heard Puyallup and Squamish, among many, many more. Any story that discusses the Pacific Northwest would be lacking without including the indigenous peoples of the region. And I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that most people who live in the Pacific Northwest today inhabit land that was originally part of an indigenous tribe, including myself. So I would like to thank those people, the descendants, those who are no longer here, and any tribes that have become extinct over the last few hundred years. Thank you. The British led many expeditions to map and claim the Pacific Northwest, both by traveling overland from the east and by traveling through the Pacific. The most famous of these explorers was Captain James Cook. Cook made 3 journeys around the Pacific, traveling all the way through the South Pacific up to the Arctic Circle. His third and final voyage brought him within sight of the Oregon coast on March 7, 1778. However, foul weather kept the crew from shore, and they continued northward up to Vancouver Island in present-day British Columbia. Cook was ultimately killed in Hawaii in February of 1777. Although Cook and his crew did not explore the land of Washington and Oregon, a member of his crew would go on to be immortalized in the Pacific Northwest. This man would later go on to map and study the Puget Sound region on his own expeditions, leaving a lasting legacy taught to all children in Washington State at 10 years old. This young man was George Vancouver. George Vancouver was born on June 22, 1757 in Norfolk, England. When he was just 13 years old, he joined the Royal Navy. By the time he was 20, he had already joined Captain Cook on his second journey in the Pacific and was part of the third and final journey. It was on these journeys that Vancouver learned navigation and became an expert sailor. Vancouver was in Hawaii when Cook was killed and helped to continue the expedition and return to England in 1780. Over the next 65 years, the land that Cook had briefly explored would be greatly contested as to who exactly had ownership over it. This land would eventually become what we know as the Pacific Northwest. To understand this dispute, we first have to take a step backwards in time to the early 1500s. The Spanish began exploring the Pacific between Mexico and the Philippines beginning in 1527. Over the next 200 years, they continued to explore this region, with some notable explorations throughout. In 1707, the Spanish galleon San Francisco Xavier, sailing from Manila to Acapulco, shipwrecked on the Oregon coast near present-day Nehalem Beach. Starting in the 1700s, the Russian explorers also began crossing the northern Pacific and established claims along the western coast of North America. In 1728, Vitus Bering discovered the Bering Straits. You might recognize this name as this is currently what we call this land today, the Bering Straits and the Bering Sea. Of course, we know now that Bering did not discover this land, as there was indigenous people there, but history is often told by people who look and sound like us. So we name most of these places today after the European explorers who claimed them from the indigenous people. In 1741, Bering, along with Alexei Shirokov, sighted portions of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. Over the next 40 years, Spanish expeditions to the northwest coast began to affirm Spain's claim to the territory. In 1774, Juan José Perez Hernandez explored the coastland and began to trade with the native peoples. In 1775, Bruno de Heceta and Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Quadra sailed northward, landing and claiming territory at points in Washington State and British Columbia. The Spanish had a different take on claiming territory. The British would often like to colonize that land, whereas the Spanish claimed the land, did a little bit of trade, maybe left a settler or two, and moved on. This becomes a point of contention later in our story. Cook's 1778 voyage to the Pacific Northwest was the first major British exploration by sea. Between the 1740s and the 1840s, these explorers, and therefore the countries that they represented, fought each other and the native peoples of the region for ownership of the territory. During this period, the nations of Russia, Spain, Great Britain, and the United States vied for control of the region. Tensions increased in the late 1700s in an incident known as the Nootka Sound Controversy. The Nootka Sound Controversy. Between 1789 and 1794, Spanish and British forces challenged each other's claims to the Pacific Northwest. The Spanish approach to colonization had been fairly the same since the 15th century. Land in anew to Europeans, land, and claim it for Spain. The British were taking a different approach to colonization, using the land and people for economic gain. The British were putting people on these new lands and using those British subjects to build the British economy. These two approaches to colonization came to a head at Nootka Sound, on the west side of Vancouver Island in present-day British Columbia. In 1789, Spanish forces in Nootka Sound started capturing British trading vessels. This brought the two nations to the brink of war, but ultimately resulted in changes to global colonization. The Nootka Sound Convention was signed in 1790, cementing the framework of colonization based on economics instead of just claims of land. Side note from me. I know, as I'm sure many of you know, that colonization in the Age of Discovery was always about economics, even though at the time it was often posed as spreading Christianity. But most of us have heard tales of the golden cities of South America. However, the Nootka Sound controversy is pivotal not just to the Pacific Northwest, but also to the westward expansion of the United States. Specifically, the acknowledgement that expansion of a country or territory is primarily for economic gain. Okay, ending my sound note. After the Nootka Sound Convention, both Spain and Great Britain sent explorers to the Pacific Northwest. Spain sent Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Quadra, and Great Britain sent George Vancouver. Both men had previously explored the area and were already familiar with it. Vancouver's expedition explored the Pacific Northwest area, mapping and surveying the region. The maps and charts created by Vancouver's expedition were the most detailed maps of the time and were used by sailors well into the 19th century. Vancouver's expedition was also the first European encounter at Puget Sound, the inland area of Washington State. Many of the locations and features mapped and surveyed by Vancouver were named after members of his crew, including Puget Sound, which is named after Peter Puget. Of course, the places the British and Spanish were exploring, mapping, surveying, and claiming as their own was not a derelict, uninhabited wasteland. As I mentioned before, people had been living in this region for thousands of years. The native people of the region had lived and thrived in this area long before Europeans laid claim to the land. The Coast Salish people lived along the coast and waterways of the Pacific Northwest from Oregon to Alaska. Both the British and the Spanish were familiar with the native people who lived on Vancouver Island, the Nootka. Upon reaching what is now the Washington coastline, Vancouver and his men encountered the Makah tribe. Vancouver noted that these people dressed and spoke very much the same as the Nootka, but with minor variances. Over the next 2 months, as Vancouver and his men explored more of the region, they discovered that, although most of the native people they encountered spoke the same languages, there were two distinct dialect groups, the Salish, of which the Nootka and Makah people belonged, and the Nisqually, which most of the Puget Sound tribes belonged to. It was here in the Puget Sound region that Vancouver and his men first saw totem poles. They were mesmerized and perplexed by these straight, tall, carved structures that jutted out of the ground. As someone who has grown up in the Pacific Northwest, the iconography of a totem pole and many of the carvings are very familiar to the region today. I mean, our national football team has a totem-inspired bird. Today, these are images we see every day, but to Vancouver and his men, these were completely foreign. These relationships and encounters were just the beginning of the long history of government and Native peoples of the region. After returning home, George Vancouver died in England at the age of 40 in 1798. Between 1790 and 1803, the Spanish claim to the region dwindled, leaving room for another nation to enter the dispute for the region, the newly formed United States. The area of the continental United States west of the Mississippi River was claimed by France as early as the 1600s, with the French stronghold of New Orleans along the Gulf of Mexico. By the mid-1700s, France controlled the most territory of any nation in North America, most of it being in this western area. Between 1762 and 1801, this area was controlled by the Spanish, who did little to develop or colonize it. In 1803, France sold the area to the United States for a total of $11.25 million. The land encompassed approximately 828,000 acres. At the time, this totaled about $13.58 an acre. In 2021 money, the purchase price would have been about $342 million, or approximately $413 an acre. I don't know if any of you have looked at the price of property lately, but that's still a pretty great deal. After the purchase, forever immortalized in American history as the Louisiana Purchase, President Thomas Jefferson tasked Meriwether Lewis to lead an expedition to explore the newly acquired territory. Lewis was Jefferson's secretary and a former captain in the United States Army. Lewis chose William Clark to aid him in the expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition, officially called the Corps of Discovery, left St. Charles, Missouri on May 14, 1804. The journey would take the Corps all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to lands that were not part of the Louisiana Purchase. I am not going to go into much more detail about the Lewis and Clark expedition, as I am planning to for a future episode. However, I do want to make note of the mapping and surveying that Lewis and Clark did on their journey. Even though there had been traders in the region for years, many of them were independent, living among the native peoples and not imposing their European ideals. There were maps of the coastland and some of the coastal waterways, but Lewis and Clark mapped their entire journey westward, as well as when they traveled back east. These maps and the relationships that were made during the journey were important to the expansion of the Americans in the Pacific Northwest during the 19th century. You know those great tall hats that men in the late 18th century and well into the 19th century wore? Well, those came from the Pacific Northwest. More precisely, they came from the beavers of the Pacific Northwest. The fur trade built up the expansion of the West. Trappers would come from all over the world to capture and acquire these furs. Pacific Northwest furs traveled all over the world, from across the continent to the large cities of the day, such as Boston and Philadelphia, to the great cities of Europe and even Japan and China. In the early 1800s, the fur trade in the Pacific Northwest was organized and economized. Instead of independent trappers and traders that had been in the region for decades, there were now trading companies that organized and profited from the fur trade. The Canadian-based Northwest Company and the American-based Pacific Fur Company both operated in the region peacefully until the War of 1812. When news of a British warship headed to the region, the Pacific Fur Company liquidated its assets to the Northwest Company. However, also at this time, a London-based company held a land grant that contained much of Western Canada and was a chief competitor in the fur trade industry to the Northwest Company. This British company would leave a lasting legacy in the Pacific Northwest, the Hudson's Bay Company. The two companies continued to clash and maintained British and Canadian dominance in the region until 1821, It was that year that the British Parliament forced the two companies to merge, creating a much larger Hudson's Bay Company. By this time, the British were looking for a stronger hold in the region to secure the southern boundary of Canada. Since Lewis and Clark's expedition, there had been a steady flow of American fur traders coming to the area. The British felt that establishing a strong presence in the region would help maintain their hold on it. It was then in 1825 that Fort Vancouver was established at the mouth of the Willamette River in present-day Vancouver, Washington. The fort served as the headquarters for the Hudson's Bay Company's trading operations from Alaska to Mexico, and as far inland as the Rocky Mountains. The fort was dedicated on March 9, 1825, and named after George Vancouver by the Hudson's Bay Company Governor Simpson. Simpson said, quote, "The object of naming it after that distinguished navigator, George Vancouver, is to identify our claim to the soil and trade with this discovery of the river and coast on behalf of Great Britain." End quote. In his 1844 book, History of the Oregon Territory and British North American Fur Trade, John Donne describes Fort Vancouver as, quote, "The fort is in the shape of a parallelogram, about 250 yards long by 150 broad, enclosed by a sort of wooden wall made of pickets or large beams firmly fixed in the ground, and closely fitted together, 20 feet high and strong secured on the inside by buttresses. At each angle there is a bastion, mounting two 12-pounders, and in the center there are some 18-pounders. But from the pacific character of the natives and the long absence of all apprehension, these cannon have become useless. The area within is divided into two courts, around which are arranged about 40 neat, strong wooden buildings, 1 story high, designed for various purposes, such as offices, apartments for the clerks and other officers, warehouses for furs, English goods, and other commodities, in which all there is the most diligent and unceasing activity and industry. There is also a schoolhouse and chapel, and a powder magazine built of brick and stone. In the center stands the governor's residence in the dining hall." End quote. Overall, the fort was an imposing structure, dominating the area and travelers. Under the oversight of Dr. George McLaughlin, the fort also initiated large-scale farming in the region, taking advantage of the fertile lands along the Columbia and Willamette rivers. This also allowed the fort to become mostly self-sufficient, providing those who lived and worked at the fort with resources throughout the year. At its peak, Fort Vancouver became home to people from all over the world. There were British and French Canadians, British, American, native peoples of the region, Russians, and even Hawaiians. Many of these who traveled to the fort were men, who ended up marrying native women. McLaughlin's own wife, Marguerite, was a Métis woman. Her French-Canadian father had married an Aboriginal woman. The Hudson's Bay Company created a profit-driven trade system that ultimately decimated some of the natural resources in the region, as well as completely changed how trade was conducted in the region. As the 1800s neared its midpoint, more and more Americans entered the region. Fort Vancouver was both a destination and a stopping point. A depression in the 1830s led to thousands of Americans moving west, establishing a greater, lasting presence in the region. Between 1840 and 1845, nearly 5,000 Americans settled in the Oregon Territory. This brought already high tensions between the United States and Great Britain to a boiling point. In 1844, when James K. Polk was elected President of the United States, he was determined to claim all of the Oregon Territory for the United States. The slogan, 5440 or Fight, meant that the United States would control all of the Oregon Territory up to the 54th parallel. However, the British took offense to this, as much of their resources were below that 54th parallel, including Fort Vancouver. In the summer of 1845, the Polk administration offered a new boundary of the 49th parallel, which the British again refused. Ultimately, the boundary between the United States and Canada was set at the 49th parallel, where it resides today. This treaty, called the Oregon Treaty, put Fort Vancouver entirely in land controlled by the United States. From 1846 to 1860, the Hudson's Bay Company maintained a much smaller presence at Fort Vancouver, leasing land and buildings to United States Army. Over the following years, the fort fell into disrepair and the location was forgotten. In the 1940s, archaeological surveys were conducted to locate the site of the fort, and the site was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1949. Starting in the 1960s, further archaeological studies were conducted in the area, and reproductions of the fort were constructed. Now, I know that was a lot of history, and in future episodes, I won't go so in-depth, but certainly let me know if you would like to. However, I feel that the history of the early European exploration of the Pacific Northwest is important to many of the stories I am going to tell. In the future, I may simply refer back to this episode for greater details. Now, on to the paranormal side of Fort Vancouver. Even though many of the buildings and locations associated with Fort Vancouver have been reconstructed and are not the original buildings from the 1820s, the land itself is still full of memories. While under the control of the United States Army, Fort Vancouver was renamed the Vancouver Barracks. A series of beautiful Victorian homes was built to house the officers and their families. Many of these homes have been restored and are still in use today, with the nickname Officers' Row. One of these houses, the Grant House, is named after Ulysses S. Grant, former president, who was stationed at Fort Vancouver prior to the Civil War. Today, the Grant House Fold Art Center and restaurant was open to visitors prior to the COVID-19 shutdowns, but is now permanently closed. The Grant House has one resident specter, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Sully. Sully served as a Union general during the Civil War and was transferred to be the commanding officer at the Vancouver Barracks in the 1870s. His pacing footsteps have been heard by staff members for decades. Sully's ghost has even reportedly been seen enjoying a cigar on the porch after hours. Alfred Sully was born in Philadelphia in 1820. He was the son of the painter Thomas Sully, who painted the likes of Queen Victoria and Andrew Jackson, and was an accomplished painter himself. After graduating from West Point in 1841, Sully held an impressive military career in the American West. Throughout his career, he used his artistic abilities to show what the West was like. Sully was the commander of Fort Vancouver from 1874 until his death in 1879 after becoming ill. He lived in the Grant House. Today, Sully can still be seen lingering the halls of the Grant House. Susie Taylor, the restaurant owner at the Grant House, saw Sully upstairs, walking the upstairs hallways. She went downstairs to ask the staff who was up there with her, and they let her know no one was there. Sully had also been seen in the restaurant and on the porch. However, Sully has also been known to have a mischievous streak. He once locked a telephone repair person inside the house. Another time, he actually stopped and spoke to a visitor, telling them, "I lived here before, and I am just looking around." It seems as though Sully, although long departed, is still keeping watch over the house. Sully is not the only remnant of Fort Vancouver's past that remains. However, some of the most intriguing stories come from the barracks, specifically Building 614. Building 614 was used as a hospital and psychiatric ward. As with many former hospitals, this one seems to retain the scars of its past, with voices and footsteps being heard and recorded, objects moving in empty rooms, and even doors unlocking themselves. The Vancouver reports, according to some reports, the morgue and blood draining area downstairs is supposedly home to a particularly angry spirit that has actually chased people from the building. The third floor, which housed psychiatric patients, is said to be haunted by screaming and laughing ghosts who make paper float to the ceiling and stick there. End quote. Steeped in history and possibly the paranormal, Fort Vancouver is a lasting reminder of how far the Pacific Northwest has come in the last 250 years. And while the National Park Service is skeptical that any area of the Fort Vancouver National Historic Site is haunted, many people believe some of those who were there have never left. Thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find us on social media at ParaNWPod and on our website, www.paranormalnwpod.com. There you'll find notes on the show, pictures, and all of our resources for this episode. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I would love your feedback. So please also like, subscribe, and leave a review. Until next time, bye.